My name is Connie Greyeyes. I'm a Cree woman from Big Stone Cree Nation that resides in Treaty 8 territory. I have two traditional names. One is Walks with the Wind and the other one is Grandmother's Spirit. I have two children, both boys named Jason and Jordan, and I am married to Chris Dick.
Connie, can you tell us a little bit about your involvement with the justice system in the modern world?
Yeah, I've been involved in all different aspects of the justice system, from being a teenager who was frequently been charged with minor offenses and dealing with Native court workers and the system on that side, as well as supporting families who are going through the justice system currently, whether it's for child protection cases or missing and murdered women's cases or assault, types like that.
Can you speak to any barriers that you've identified with Indigenous peoples accessing the current legal systems?
I think the biggest barrier is poverty. There's no doubt that if you have money, you're able to access better legal services. And that in turn causes our populations in prisons and things to be overrun by Indigenous people. And the biggest barrier is clearly monetary and poverty.
So how would you identify what specific legal traditions, speaking from an Indigenous perspective, to use if the offender and victim came from two communities with differences in their traditions?
I think the first thing to be mindful of is where the offense occurred, whose territory was it on, and that is where you would base how to deal with it through justice, whether one community uses community justice circles or if the other community doesn't. You know, it really depends on which territory all of this occurred in.
Very good. Do you agree? Okay, so we read the Burroughs article, and his article stated that Indigenous legal traditions operate already in Canada and form part of our legal foundations. Would you agree with that statement?
No, I completely disagree with that statement. You know, traditionally we didn't need to do this whole legal system. Our communities dealt with offenders as well as victims in our own way, and they weren't it was more of the restorative justice model, where the communities know how best to, I wouldn't even use the word punish, but to hold that person accountable for their actions. We don't follow this whole model of you did this wrong and now you have to go to jail for it. You know, we gave the person an opportunity to learn from that mistake and what's the word, work in the community to restore their credibility or what have you within the community.
If considering the modern day system, and we do have some restorative justice practices involved in our legal system, but to you, what would further integration look like?
I think right off the bat, we really need to be mindful of the impacts of residential schools and day schools and racism and what they have on our people. And when you're looking at some of the offenses that are being occurred, you know, quite like a handful out of 10 are being committed while somebody is under the influence of drugs or alcohol. You know, that if we can get to the root of all of that, there would be less people going through the justice system. And, you know, what's another way to say that?
So kind of integrating more of a healing system.
Exactly.
As opposed to a punitive system.
Exactly. You know, if you talk to offenders that are repeat offenders and end up in jail over cycles, they'll tell you themselves that the things that they learned more about crime and doing crimes in prison than they did out. You know, it's not enough to just throw somebody in jail. You have to give them some tools for when they come out, because lots of times they don't know how to live in society again. They've been in for so long and that they just can't function, so they end up being repeat offenders because it's what they know. And I do like the fact that sometimes a healing lodge is offered. It has to be a circumstance though. I mean, there's cases where people were sent to healing lodges that have grossly abused children. And I mean, there has to be some kind of line drawn as to who would be able to have access to that healing lodge. That's not saying that the person that grossly abused children doesn't have the right to access some type of healing, but typically healing lodges are very low, they're not just completely locked up 24/7 or anything. It's a very free environment, and you really need to be mindful of who is a candidate for something like that.
And if that was the case, who do you think should make those decisions as to who could be going to a healing lodge or who couldn't?
I think that the Indigenous communities would be able to work together and set up guidelines for that, and that you follow them, no exceptions. There's got to be somebody that can come up with that guideline or the whatever you need to have to in order to go to a healing lodge, but it has to be by Indigenous people. There's too many times where we let that colonial mindset come into our lives, and that's not how we operate. So I think that it has to be Indigenous led.
I agree. So like you stated before, we touched a bit on residential schools and the impact of colonialism, and we can't discuss Indigenous legal traditions in Canada without acknowledging those impacts. Do you agree that with the video that Canada has awakened to this sense of the impacts of colonialism on the Indigenous people?
No, I think that using awakened is a real stretch. Maybe they're becoming aware of it, but recent cases in the media, big cases, it's pretty clear that they don't understand the impacts of what colonialism and residential schools and that have had on Indigenous people and continue to have. The injustices that Indigenous people still face within the justice system. We have cases where women's body parts are being brought in to justify death, and there's no way that you can honestly say that Canada has come a long way with dealing with Indigenous people. They've started a journey, and they're on like the first part of that journey. It's a long way to go, and certainly within the justice system, it's not evident that there has been significant changes yet.
What's your opinion on the Gladue report? If you can also define for us what the Gladue report is supposed to be.
For my understanding of the Gladue report was that for offenders, they took into consideration the traumas that person has gone through, and they apply it to the background of that individual and what crimes they may or may not have committed. And it kind of gives you a bit of an understanding as to who that person is and maybe why they are the way that they are. A lot of people that I know that have used the Gladue report have come from very, very terrible child abuses when they were young, sexual assault, abuse by family, by friends, terrible drug and alcohol addiction within their families, which all incidentally stems from residential schools and colonialism. So the meaning of having that Gladue report is so that you could take into account the traumas that somebody has experienced. I mean, a lot of people could have a Gladue report written about them. They don't necessarily end up in the justice system, but I think that in some instances the Gladue report is really valuable, but also for me it's dependent on the crime. I mean, there is some things that, yes, you can write a Gladue report on, and yes, it should be taken into consideration, but also there are some things that it shouldn't be, like murdering a child or murdering women or men. You know, I think that yes, it can be taken into consideration as opposed to maybe the kind of services that that person might need. But a lot of people have misinterpreted the Gladgy report that it's a get out of jail free card. And, you know, honestly, I can't say whether I agree with that, but I do think that in using a Gladgy report that it should be, in my mind, used more for what services you can offer that person. Not something to get out of jail free, but something that gives you a guideline as how much trauma that person actually has experienced in their life.
Awesome. Is there anything else that you would like to add when considering Indigenous legal traditions and the modern day system?
I think that the modern day system could learn a lot from the Indigenous aspect of the way that we used to handle crimes and things in our communities. You know, we're never going to stop people from committing crime, but we can start a journey with somebody, and everybody has that opportunity to learn from their mistakes. Like with the way that the jail systems are now, you know, it's a lock up, you get out, eat, get locked back up. You know, there needs to be an opportunity for the people that are in there to start dealing with trauma in a real way. And yeah, I think that they could learn a lot from that aspect of the way that communities work with their members.
Excellent. Thank you, Connie.
Mm-hmm.